The United States is in a civil war. The president is corrupt and several states seceded the Union. So what is really going on in 2024 civil war? Let's break it all down. At the center of the conflict is the president. Prior to the events of the movie, he established what is described as a fascist regime aiming to keep him in power. He is now in his third term as president, which is illegal. The 22nd Amendment of the Constitution states that no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. But we don't know how this happened or how he built a political movement to subdue elections. The president also disbanded the FBI, which is described as a big deal. Although many real-life presidents clashed with the Federal Bureau of Investigations, none could eliminate the agency. Under the Constitution, the FBI director is an executive branch official and can be removed by the president. Bill Clinton dismissed the FBI director at the recommendation of the Attorney General after his ethics came into question. Donald Trump also dismissed the FBI director, but as Tim Weiner wrote in the Washington Post, short of sending tanks down Pennsylvania Avenue and blowing the J. Edgar Hoover building, Trump cannot stop the FBI. No commander-in-chief ever has. So one can only imagine how violent and forceful disbanding the FBI must have been in civil war. It's an act of tyranny and it undermines the independence of the judiciary system. The president also rejected the notions of checks and balances on his powers. The movie is vague about this, but the president likely undermined the legislative and judicial branches. How else could he serve a third term in office? And finally, the president is said to have used the US military against citizens. Some characters mention the use of military drones against Americans. In the face of an authoritarian takeover in Washington, some states unilaterally seceded from the Union. The most prominent states to have seceded are Texas and California. These two states joined forces, mounting a military rebellion aiming to topple the corrupt president. They're known as the Western Forces. Other states also seceded from the Union. Most southern states, including Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, have joined Florida to create the Florida Alliance. This alliance appears to be engaged in an effort to convert loyalist states into secessionist states and seems willing to resort to violence to achieve this goal. At the beginning of the movie, the president addresses the nation and announces that the Carolinas refuse to join the Florida Alliance, opting to remain loyal to Washington. But later, journalists discussed a brewing conflict between the Loyalists and the Florida Alliance at the South Carolina border. Most northern states also rejected the authority of Washington under the corrupt president. These states include Idaho, Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota, Oregon, South Dakota, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. Together, they are known as the New People's Army Alliance. Although they may not be the most significant military alliance of the three seceding factions, they control much land. The other states appear to remain loyal to the United States under the current president. Although the Western Forces, the Florida Alliance, and the New People's Alliance all reject the president's authority, there is a widespread belief that these three factions do not coordinate. Some characters speculate that the various secessionist alliances will fight each other for power if DC falls, underlying the existing cultural and political tensions between these factions. But all can agree that the president cannot be allowed to usurp power. At some point, the president is heard addressing the nation on the radio. He says he rejected the terms of a peace summit between the Loyalists and the secessionist states. In the movie, the Civil War is mostly explored through the perspective of journalists. Lee, Joel, and Sammy mention working for the New York Times and Reuters. It also appears that the war undermined the press. They say the New York Times is in shambles. These journalists aim to document the war and objectively examine this unprecedented event in American history, and they're risking their lives to do so. They are the free press and their motivations are noble. Their freedom to report on current events is a fundamental principle of a free society. But at times of war, freedoms are challenged and attempts to silence the press become more common, especially in a fascist regime. For instance, the Loyalist Army gained a reputation for assassinating reporters. Despite that, the main characters believe they have a unique duty to report on the Civil War. Lee, the main character portrayed by Kirsten Dunst, has experience covering war zones for the New York Times. Prior to the events of the movie, she was sent to various war theaters around the world, and her horrific photos were published in America. She says, "Every time I survived the war zone and got the photo, I thought I was sending a warning home." But here they are in the midst of a civil war at home. Lee and Joel plan to travel from New York City to Washington, D.C. They want to interview and photograph the president. He hasn't given an interview in 14 months. Sammy thinks this is a suicide mission because journalists have been executed in Washington during the war. The Loyalists want to impede the freedom of the press, but Lee and Joel think this could be the president's last interview and photo because the Western forces are about 120 miles from DC. They set a base in Charlottesville, Virginia. The Florida Alliance is said to also be closing in on DC, so time is counted for the president. We also learned that the war has significantly impacted major infrastructure in the country. Notably, the interstate highway system is badly damaged. To make it to Washington, D.C., they would need to use alternative routes. Sammy says it will be impossible to get anywhere near Philadelphia, so Lee and Joel will have to drive west as far as Pittsburgh and circle in from West Virginia. It's the only route available to reach DC. Sammy says he wants to go to Charlottesville, Virginia to report on the front line. So the three decide they'll attempt the ride together. The plan is to drop off Sammy in Charlottesville, where the Western forces are fighting the Loyalists. And then Lee and Joel can continue their journey to Washington to interview the president. They're also accompanied by a rookie photojournalist named Jesse. They travel in a van, identifying them as members of the press. When they are embedded with fighting forces to cover the events of the war, they wear protective gear, also identifying them as members of the press. This should afford them some protection and access during the war. But at times, hatred of the press makes them targets. Their journey from New York to DC tells us a lot about the state of the East Coast. For instance, we see abandoned cars on the highway, and they pass through a military checkpoint. We also learn about the impact of the war on the economy. When they stop at a gas station to refuel, armed men ask them to present a fuel permit. This is a sign that specific resources like gas are rationed. This too is inspired by real history. For instance, during World War II, goods like tires, bikes, and fuel were rationed. To buy these items, consumers had to present paperwork to pay for the item. Coupon permits were issued. Americans were also encouraged to car share to aid war efforts. Because they don't have a fuel permit, Lee offers to pay more for gas. She offers $300 for half a tank, but the man says it's nowhere near enough. When Lee says she's offering $300 Canadian dollar, the man finally accepts. I saw this movie in the theater here in Toronto, and this scene prompted the audience to laugh. Obviously, the idea that the Canadian dollar is more valuable and in demand is funny to Canadian audiences, but it tells us that the US economy took a severe plunge because of the war. There are many possible reasons for this, such as trade declines and capital investments taken abroad. Civil wars are not vectors for economic prosperity. Behind the gas station, Tony and Lee find two men hanging from an abandoned car wash. They've been hanging there for 2 days after they were caught looting the gas station. The hanging men can be seen from the road. They're not trying to hide them from public view. This indicates a total collapse of law enforcement. And when Lee asks the men to pose with them for a photo, he gladly obliges. Clearly, he does not think he'll face consequences for hanging and torturing two men. This scene shows how much the rule of law is being undermined during the Civil War. Throughout the movie, we see various theaters of war. Let's break some of them down. Early on their journey to Washington, the four journalists stop at an abandoned JCPenney parking lot to photograph a gunned-down helicopter. Throughout the movie, we see signs of urban warfare, including in dense residential areas. Urban warfare is particularly worrying because it jeopardizes the safety of innocent civilians. It's more difficult to distinguish civilians from soldiers in a city, especially as some civilians seek to defend their homes and businesses from attackers. Other signs of urban warfare include this explosion in New York City, gunfire lighting up the sky, gunshots exchanged between the Loyalist Army of the Carolinas and members of the Florida Alliance, buildings on fire, and at the end of the movie, Washington, D.C., a city of over 600,000 citizens, is the theater of unprecedented urban warfare. Don't worry, we will discuss the toppling of the government later in this video. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. I discuss various popular movies and shows. You can also hit the like button. One like goes a long way with the algorithm. Thank you. As war rages in urban centers, civil society is at work to help affected civilians. For instance, on their journey to Washington, D.C., the journalists find shelter in a stadium where an NGO called the Global Relief Fund runs what appears to be an encampment. A canteen and tents are provided for civilians in need. With the war reaching urban centers, some civilians have lost their homes or been displaced. We see children running around in the encampment, suggesting that entire families were displaced. Although the country is in the midst of a civil war, not all civilians are affected equally. When the journalists arrive in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, Joel asks, "Did we just travel into a time portal?" This scene shows how some parts of America live seemingly ordinary lives despite the atrocities of the war. When asked if she's aware of the civil war in the country, the woman at the thrift store says she's aware, but their town just tries to stay out of it, as if it was not their problem too. But when they come out of the shop, Sammy notices they're being watched by armed men standing on rooftops. I think the movie makes it clear that identity is an underlying theme of the Civil War. This is best exemplified in the most talked about scene of the movie. The group comes face to face with this soldier from the Florida Alliance as he's digging a mass grave. The soldier, portrayed by Jesse Plemons, wonders whether or not the journalists deserve to live. Right away, he assassinates this man, despite the group saying he's one of their colleagues. So Joel steps in. He says, "We're American," in an attempt to escape death. But the man asks, "What kind of American are you?" When Joel says he's from Florida, he spares him. When Jessie says she's from Missouri, he spares her. And when Lee says she's from Colorado, he spares her too. The soldier considers them real Americans, but when comes Tony's turn, he's paralyzed by fear after seeing another Asian man being assassinated before him. When he says he's from Hong Kong, he gets shot. There is a racial component here. The two men who were shot were of Asian descent. Everyone else was spared. By the way, in this scene, Sammy rescues the group and gets shot as they're driving away. This is also a tragic point in the movie because Sammy's goal was to reach Charlottesville, where the Western Forces military base is, but he did not make it alive. This also marks the beginning of the third act of the movie, and it's all about the Western Forces of Texas and California successfully toppling the corrupt president in Washington. First, we see the Western Forces' military might. They're organized, and their military base in Charlottesville is massive. They have fighter jets, artillery, tanks, and helicopters. They have it all. Members of the press are embedded within the Western Forces, and they're welcome there. The Western Forces want press coverage. We learn that the Western Forces plan to move in on Washington imminently after the Loyalist Army surrendered. DC and the White House are only protected by a few die-hard soldiers and a handful of Secret Service agents. And that's how the Western Forces managed to roll into Washington. We see scenes of urban warfare at the steps of iconic symbols of US democracy. For instance, the Lincoln Memorial is blown up. Eventually, a special tactical force from the Western Forces breach White House security. In the press briefing room, they encounter a representative for the president. She says the president will surrender to the Western Forces if they can guarantee him safe passage out of the country into neutral territory, but they refuse. The remaining journalists are embedded with these special forces, allowing them to document history as it unfolds. This will eventually cost Lee's life. Eventually, the Western Forces kill the president, and that's how the movie ends. What do you think happens after the events of Civil War? Let me know in the comments below, and click the top link for more breakdown videos.